This, children, is a quad. And if we talk about quad, this is the first thing you're going to see is a quad, and usually with the letters, we call it KTAD. And there's a reason that we use the diagonals that we'll talk about later. But this is what you're going to see. So every time you're thinking about a quad, for the initial parts of the discussion and quite a while, not only just imagine these four parts. Do I have a pointer? Is this a pointer?
Yeah, I see it.
You see where I'm moving? Okay,
Yeah.
good. Oh, good. Okay, so it's recording that. So when you look at KTAD, you're going to look at a quad, first of all, is broken into these four parts. And those are such that it's not just four cubbies to put things in, but in fact, position holds meaning. And the meaning pertains to these letters of K, T, A, and D. And so whenever we're talking about quad, picture that. That's the standard quad. That's the starting point. It's not just the squares, but it's the square broken into four parts, and each four of the four parts, depending on its position within the overall quad, each of those four parts holds a unique meaning, and together they work as a family. Okay, so when we're talking about a quad that pertains to this, well, it's a family of things, each of which is a different flavor. Each has its own function, each has its own way of working, its own perspective, but it's dependent upon position within the quad. Chris, do you want to say anything about that?
No, I think that sounds exactly correct. I think I think
What's a good quad good for is something to say. Why do we care about quads?
well, right, and what is the content? What does it represent, or what does it
Well, let's tell them
mean?
why it's worth their time first. Let's just say, why should you worry about quads? And what a quad is, one of the things that a quad is, amongst the many things a quad is it is a little circuit of narrative. And narrative is based on human psychology. And so this is also a little circuit of narrative psychology. And with that little circuit, you can figure out how people fall victim to counterproductive thinking within their own heads, how they create blind spots where they don't see that they're actually the cause of the problem, or that they're wrong and somebody else is right. They can't even entertain it. They can't even see it. Okay. All of that's described by this simple little quad. And so you can use this quad as a building block. It can become a very large collection of these, a super molecule of this little circuit, as it were, in which you can see all the different nuances of what's going on inside somebody's head, or inside a narrative in a story, fictional, or a narrative in the real world. This, just think of it, if you will, think of it, if you will, as the DNA of story, but not in a helix, just in a little flat quad. It shows you the four bases of the DNA of narrative and narrative psychology. And so just as you'd look at the basis of actual DNA and see that it forms a helix, this too forms a helix, but it allows you to create the genome of any narrative. You're going to build it out of these four bases, the K, the T, the A, and the D. And so this thing is worth your while because it allows you not only to analyze the genome of any narrative and understand how all the bases were put together to create that particular beast, but also how it functions and its lifespan from the beginning of the narrative to the end of the narrative. Same things you do with a creature using DNA when you get its complete genome, but also it lets you to build things from scratch, not just analyze what exists, and to build a critter, a narrative critter that does just what you want it to do. Are its eyes going to be blue? Is it going to be angry? Well, all these things, can be determined in advance by constructing through the genetics of narrative. You can then take this KTAD, these four bases, and with the knowledge about how they go together and how they work, which you have to use in genetics as well. You have to know what can go together and how they work and how they create the folded proteins and all that stuff. Well, we got that theory, and this tells you how to do it. So it's these pieces and then an instruction set of how to use them to a particular effect. But with it, and why it's worth your time is whether it's a tiny little narrative in your family or a great big narrative in the real world about nations considering blowing each other up, whether it's about how terrorists are going to do things, or it's a fictional account of something that just moves people in a way that makes them cry or laugh or alters them in a form of propaganda so that they come out of the theater feeling a different way about something and acting a different way, leading to different social change. All of that stuff comes from this little quad, these four bases of the genetics of narrative and the instructions about how to use them and to what effect, so how you can create things. So this is a large discussion. It's like a huge college course of stuff to get through all that. And this is just 101, and it's the first moment of the first day. So no, that's why it's worth your while. It will open up a whole world of accuracy in narrative analysis and narrative creation in the real world or in fiction. And in the real world, at a social level, a national level, or even within your own head at a psychological level. How about that?
That's pretty heady stuff.
It is heady, heady. No, Headley.
Yeah, Hedley Lamar. Um, okay, so
Blazing Quad.
let's be very K-like right now, and let's just talk about the stuff of the quadrants.
Sure, why don't you carry on from here? You're very K.
I am very K. So, God, just the editor in my head is just like going crazy.
It's tough because there's no good place to start. But you could first identify what the K, T, A, and D mean. What
Right.
those stand
So
for.
K represents knowledge, which is akin to a mental form of mass. T is thought, which is a mental form of energy. A is ability, which is sort of a mental equivalency to space. And D is desire, which is sort of a mental equivalence to time.
We'll explain all that later, but that just tells you what they are. Mass and energy, space and time is K and T and A and D. And we'll tell you why, because it doesn't sound like it should be. We'll tell you why later.
Right. So some of the things about K, one way to think about K as knowledge, you can also think of it about as memory, stored knowledge. If you're looking at it in terms of the world around you, one way of looking at it is in terms of time, in terms of the time, which would be the past, things that have already happened, so that they are already they've already been known, as opposed to something that is yet to be, or is currently happening, or is in the process of developing. So a K, looking at as a point of reference, is saying, let's look at things as a point, generally speaking, a particle, a something that is, and I use known in the most abstract sense, not necessarily understood, but familiar, but something that has been previously encountered. And so that, from a narrative point of view, is important because it's one of the areas in which you want to explore. It's like, okay, here's where this is what I know, or this is the things that I know, or these are the things I discover about things that have happened. That would all generally fall in that purview of knowledge. Does that sound okay?
Okay, let's yeah, that's good. Let me say a few words about knowledge, and then we'll move on to wherever you want to go next. Which of them? If you think about mass and energy and space and time, mass and energy are kind of like at a simpler level. You can hit something with a billiard ball with a pool cue, and it'll go where you want it to go. And they you can look at the way they impact each other, and you can pretty much calculate all that. It's something you can hold in your head. But when you look at space and time, it gets a little wanky, because in one sense you can say, well, okay, mass is the stuff that occupies space, and you can look at it and say, hey, okay. And you can say time is the progression of all stuff. But as Einstein showed, time is flexible. It's not just a fixed scale. So when we look at knowledge and thought and ability and desire as the four bases, and you think about them as mass and energy and space and time, the knowledge and thought is the simple stuff. It's like a little bit of knowledge. You can generate, move bits of knowledge around with thought and build something like a brick wall or a foundation of understanding by moving some pieces of knowledge together, different disparate things, when you move them around using energy, using thought, mental energy. And ability basically says, what do you know and what do you not know? What you not know is all that open area between the mass. If knowledge is mass, what you know are these little points of knowledge, but you can tell that they're all clumped together and you think you know everything. They're spread out, a little bit about this, a lot about that, different sizes of knowledge, different sizes of mass spread throughout the universe of your view, which is what ability is. Because ability is the mind's way. It's a weird word to use, I admit it, but it's mind's way of saying, how sure am I that I can understand this and do something in this situation? How well do I know this situation? Well, that depends on the ratio of what you know to what you don't know. And what you don't know is really what is the range of ability, but includes what you know. It's the whole area of what could be known. Okay. Just like space, the whole area of what could have stuff in it, mass. But here is what we're looking at as pieces that we know, the mass that exists within this realm, and all the rest of it's open space or the unknown. And that calculates your ability, how well you can do things, which is great to an organism's survival. And desire, that's a lot like time, space-time that's a space-time continuum right along there, A to D, because time, in order to have desire, you have to be able to look at the way things were, the way things are, and the way things might be. And you have to draw a line through that and say, were they better with the way they were than now? What's the trend? How are things going? And then look forward beyond that and say, the direction they're going from here, is that going to be better or worse? And can I change the course of that? Well, all that has to do with time. You're not just looking at the here and now. You're looking backward to see how it got here and forward to then use that information to understand where it's going to go. So just to understand this quad a little bit better, knowledge, thought, ability, desire. Knowledge, as Chris was talking about here, is the thing that's the most set in stone, even though it's not really. It's like you look at a table and you say, okay, that's a table, it's a thing, but really it used to be a tree. And also it's made up of atoms that are mostly empty space, as we know. But still, at the level of our perception, we say that is a table. So what do you know? Okay. And how firmly do you know it? How thoroughly do you know it? How sure of you are what you know? Well, that starts to move into ability. Now, if we put all that together, just to get a feel for this quad and what knowledge is in it, you can look at knowledge and thought could be mass or energy, but it could be noun and verb grammatically. Again, noun and verb are easy. And then you look at the other side, and up at A, you have adjective and you have adverb, which are the modifiers or the areas or realms in which noun and verb work, would be the adjectives and the adverbs. So that's another way to look at it. You could look at it as earth and water, which would be K and T, and then wind and fire, which would be A and D. They're not material as much as earth and water. So earth, K, the most solid of things, water, the flowing thing that can change and carve earth, and earth can direct water, so K and T, and A and D is the wind, which you can feel it, and fire, which is a whole different beast. One of the things you'll notice about these quads is that whenever you're looking at a quad, whatever in the D position is going to be out of left field a little bit. And there's reasons for it we'll talk about later, but you can actually almost determine if you have an accurate quad that's really taking four things that belong together and function in that kind of DNA of narrative way, is that K and T are one level, A and D are another. A is something that still bears a material sense to K and T, but when you get down to D, like fire or adverb, it's the one that's a little bit out of left field, a little bit wanky. And so right now, everything we built in Dramatica is based on taking the K perspective, definitive. It is or it is not. I know it or I do not know it. What is its actual nature? That makes a very definitive system that allows us to then project how narratives will unfold later because of that accuracy. But all these others are looked at from the K perspective. So we see knowledge is the key. We see thought through the eyes of knowledge, ability through the eyes of knowledge, desire through the eyes of knowledge. So all those are looked at in the system that we have first built from that K perspective. And when I mentioned earlier, I said, why don't you do it to Chris? And he said, okay, I'll start with K here. And I said, well, you're the K person. You're the most K. And he said, yes, I am. Because he always goes for wanting to make sure things are definitive. And I'm always down in D going la la land. Yeah, but look at the pretty puppies, you know? So yeah, that I'm going to leave it there because I'm beginning to do pretty puppies.
Aha. Yes, of course. What she said. Yeah, I mean, you covered an awful lot of different topics there.
Puppies.
I think it's really important to understand that, one of the concepts, I mean, this isn't something we created, but it's something we recognized, is that in order to have meaning, you have to have a context. Without context, there is no meaning.
Yeah. I
So in
remember the
order
first time
to,
you said that. Brilliant. Brilliant.
so, well, so one of the things we had to do eventually is to decide on what the context was going to be for this entire model. And the context we said was going to be, we're going to take this K perspective on things from a practical point of view. And by that, I mean, since K is it looks at things sort of a particle way, it looks at things as separate. It's very much the same way that the English language is designed, how a lot of male mental sex individuals see the world. American, particularly the American culture, much of it sees the world that way. And it's not that you can't see a lot of other things, but that's where the bias is. That's sort of the assumption that it it is there and it's not going to change. That's just the way things are based on that perspective. We could have chosen other perspectives, except for the fact that, oh, and also because programming very much is computer programming is very much also based in that K world, where everything is, binary, at the lowest level, and everything is, even though you can have things that appear to be non-binary, ultimately, though, they go down to, zeros and ones. Um, and that's the level of uh, K we're talking about. At the most base level, we're looking at things as zeros and ones. Is it or isn't it? And then any kind of gray areas are just approximations based on how many is it's or isn't it's, not actual true, like photographics grayscale, where it's a continuous tone as opposed to steps along a grayscale. So the that having that bias allowed us some had some real benefits. It also did open us up to some blind spots, which eventually we'll talk about it, or we can, whenever we talk about it, we'll talk about it. But the benefit is that it allowed us to use certain types of language and data organization that was conducive to the American way of communicating, the way that computers communicate, as well as an inherent bias in our target audience at the time, which was the American film industry, the American narrative industry, particularly with films. And by looking at things that way, we were able to see certain kinds of uh, points of reference that are consistent from one narrative to another, in that the frames of reference are consistent, not the values of those frames, not the values that are associated with them. And that allows us then to say something definitive, again, K, very definitive, about a narrative that was that completely did not take into account subject matter. So these were aspects of narratives that were not related to the narrative's subject matter at all. And that's what we found, where the places where a lot of writers were having problems were were the fact they were not able to get that sort of objectified view of, here's a consistent way to understand how a story works, and then within your own story, how does it work within yours, because you can't seem to get that objectivity. So that K perspective was conducive to helping writers see it that way, see those insights. That
You know what might be useful now is to show them where this is headed by showing the flat table of story elements and also the tower view without really explaining it in great detail, but just saying this quad, when it iterates through all of the processes of the mind dealing with a problem, trying to solve it or come to terms with the situation and in its world and figure out if it needs to change or if it needs to hold out for its world to change, all the complex narratives we have, there's really, it goes into a lot of different areas. The mind is not just based on four little processes called knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. In fact, we iterate those so that we're looking at knowledge under this context, ability under that context, and the result of comparing knowledge to thought leads to this perspective. And there is a maximum size of that, it turns out. We call it the size of mind constant. And what that means is that when you start from an overview of a problem and you figure it down to the smallest detail you can through all the different kinds of thought processes available to you, there's a limit to how far down you can look before you lose track of that overview and you can't hold it in your head at the same time. Similarly, if you start from a teeny tiny problem and you want to see all its implications and you figure it out to the biggest scale that you can, there's a limit to how many levels and how broad you can get before that problem that you're looking at the bottom would become invisible because you can't hold it in your head where you go up another level. It has to be with a certain number of levels. So that's the size of mind constant. And when we figured out all those iterations over a 3-year period working on this blasted theory, we ended up finding that this limit could be described in a couple of different ways. One of them was called the periodic table of story elements, or periodic table of narrative elements. And it took this basic quad and then iterated it all as far as it could go, dividing mental considerations into different families, the same way you would in chemistry with the periodic table, where you have the rare earths and the noble gases. We found that these considerations at a high level, a family level, well, they had all these smaller considerations that were all part of that family, but each one kind of unique. So can you bring up an image, Chris, of
yes,
the table?
I can.
Okay, and there's two views of it. We're going to show you one first. This is the easiest to get a hold of. It's there it is. Okay, this is each one of those little white quads that you see is just like that quad. And you look at the upper left-hand corner of well, look at activity and look under understanding and activity. And then look down below that where it says instinct. And then you see knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. And that's the quad we were just looking at. That's the seed quad, as it were. And then if we pull all the way back, we can see that they're in nested families, families within families, like nested Russian dolls. And each one is like the rare earths, the noble gases, all that stuff. They have an identity to the family. Fluorine and chlorine are very similar, okay, but not exactly the same. And the deeper you go, the more fine-tuned are the differences, and the higher you go, the more they're lumped into these large categories. So this is a map of narrative, just a flat map of narrative, and it shows you when you carry that viewpoint of figuring out a problem as far as you can, either from the little bottom quad, knowledge, thought, ability, and desire, all the way to the top level, which we call the class level. That's as far as you can go, because you can't have a better broad bandwidth of mind beyond that level without either having to give up this thing that's small at the bottom to see a higher level, or give up the higher level to go deeper down to the to the nitty gritty. This is as much as you can hold in your head for reasons we can discuss later. So you don't have to trust us, but just, hold off your judgment until we actually get a reason, the time to tell you why it's that way. But the other view actually has some value too. This view is the tower view, we call it. And basically it's an expanded view, putting the families separated in a vertical sense so you can see how they're nested. It's a lot easier to see that in this projection, this 3D projection here. Same stuff, just in a different arrangement so that it's all exploded out and we can see the moving parts. And the only thing I'll say about this is when you talk about how the mind is trying to use all of these mental processes to try to understand what's going on and what's my best pathway through it going forward. That's what narrative is really all about, just those two things. What's happened? What's it mean? How do I understand what's happening? And then with that, how do I figure out my best course moving forward to either try to change things or change myself or hold off or push forward or whatever, all that, those two items, what is it? And where should I be going? Where is it going to go? And how do I want to maybe change that? Okay, all those kinds of considerations are taking these processes we have that are visible in this expanded chart and twisting and turning it like a Rubik's Cube. You can imagine flipping on any quad, like knowledge and thought could change position and flip from one place to another. Or you could look at it as rotating like a clock, clockwise or counterclockwise, which changes the place at which you start the process, and that can alter the outcome. So it's psychologically or materially, it can alter the outcome by starting a different place. Like, for example, if you have spaghetti and you're trying to cook spaghetti, if you decide you're going to heat the water to boiling and then put in the spaghetti, you're going to get some good spaghetti. But if you decide you're going to put in the spaghetti and then heat the water to boiling, you'll end up with mush. So the order in which things happen and meaning changes. We often say a slap followed by a scream is different than a scream followed by a slap. If you're slapped and then you scream, well, then you're responding to that pain and maybe the surprise of receiving it. But if you scream and then it's followed by a slap, well, that might mean somebody trying to bring you to your senses when you're hysterical. So taking the same things and putting them in a different order has a big impact. This shows you the order they start out at, the one in which everything's aligned. K is aligned with K all the way down. T is aligned with T all the way down. All those four bases, everything's consistent, balanced, synchronous. And then a problem comes into your world, either at the top level or the bottom world, and it flips a couple of things. For example, one quad has a feeling and logic in it, logic and feeling. And in that quad with logic and feeling, normally you bring them to bear in a particular order under certain circumstances. But it can very be, oh yeah, there it is, logic and feeling right there in the lower left corner. And if you come up with something where you're saying, okay, I've tried to figure this out 20 times and you're telling your friend, I've tried to figure this out and I can't make it work. Do you have any ideas? No, I don't have any other ideas. I just can't understand, logically a way to deal with this problem. And the answer to it that you really need to know is you got to go with your heart, go with your feelings. Don't use your logic here. Just let go and go with your heart. How many stories for kids have you seen in animation about that, where the message is, follow your heart? Okay. And that's valid, because it may be that in this particular situation, logic, the way it's always been used, where you've always used it, isn't working and you need to try something else. So you put one in the back burner, logic goes on the back burner, feeling goes up in front. And with that little twist, you've now created a mindset in which you're not as balanced as you were before you met the universe. Hello, Mr. Universe. I am this. The universe says, yeah, but that's not compatible with me. Okay, so now I have to flip logic and feeling when you realize that you're not getting anywhere holding on to logic. And so you flip them, and now you put feeling first. Well, you're different. You may not even feel different, but you are. And your mental processes that all stem from that low level change, everything that follows from that's going to be different than you were when you were all lined up in the right families of rare earths and noble gases. So we don't want to go into much detail. That's conceptual. Let's go back to the full view of that tower. And so that's what the tower does, is like a Rubik's Cube. It lets you twist and turn these items to represent the kinds of changes we have to make in ourselves and our mindset to either have the strength to hold out long enough to see if we can make our world get in line with what we want, or to adapt to a world that will not budge. Okay, and that's what this explains, is the whole pathway of twisting and turning makes that helix of DNA. In this case, a quad helix, not a double helix. We'll talk more about that later. Last thing, click on the flat one again, which makes it more simple, please, Clarice, if you would. And there it is. That's where we are when we look at all flat, nice and neat. Nothing's out of position. Nobody's made any changes as a result of their life experience that, I have to act this way because that always gets me in trouble. And suddenly you put logic instead of feeling, or feeling instead of logic. Okay. All that's what happens. But it's the heart of narrative, and it's the size of mind constant. And that's the largest that a single narrative can be. Anything smaller than that, you can't hold in your mind as a single narrative, but you can have multiple narratives, and you can have a story that progressively moves into tighter narratives, but you have to leave the old ones behind and not think of them at the same time. So there's storytelling things you can do to get around that, but you still can't hold more than this in your mind at one time. And now we know what that little quad can do for us. We know that it has a K, T, A, and D. We know what those things mean conceptually, and how they mirror the basis in DNA, and how they look like mass and energy and space and time, and why, and how the entire range of conjectures we have has a maximum size of mind constant. And then things get out of order and twisted and rotated in space and in time, because we have to adapt to our world, or try to hold out, build the strength to have it adapt to us. There you go. Make of it
So
what you will.
one other thing I wanted to point out is that in terms of the size of mind idea, it's it is again in all dimensions. So if we look here, it's easiest to see it in the flat one, but I'm going to show you initially here. If we look at this and we look down at the very bottom, we see a quad, which is the smallest unit. That's the TKAD of any particular quad. Not necessarily maybe in that arrangement, because as you get further and further away and in the more granular, it gets kind of less and less, seemingly less and less binary in terms of K, T, A, and D. You have that one right here, knowledge, thought, but it's chaos and order. But all of these in some way represent that same relationship in a quad. But then you can look at it not only as in vertical, you can see there's a quad. There are 4 layers. And in fact, the top layer is this in the relationship with the second to last layer, or the third layer, the variations. They are a pair, and then the types and the elements are a pair, as much as the situation and fixed attitude are a pair, and activity and manipulation are a pair. So you've got quads going vertically, and you have quads going horizontally, but then you also have quads going horizontally in different scales. So down here is the smallest scale. That is just 4 units. But you can then say, all right, but I can scale it, sort of like increase my resolution. So now I have a quad of quads. So this would be the first one. This would be the second one. And then I have a quad of a quad of quads. So here are these 4. And then ultimately you have the top, the widest, broadest view, the class view. So it's not only just the littlest, but also it works at the different scales at the different levels. The bottom level has all 4 laterally. So you can go from a single quad all the way to the broadest quad of 64 elements in each. But at the other layers at the top, you only have a single quad, but then you have a quad here and a quad of quads. And down here you have the quad and the quad of quads, and then the quad of those, we call the quad of quads, we call a set. And then down at the bottom, because it's 64 elements, we call that a chess set. So it's just all the resolutions, all the dimensions effectively, all have that same ability to look at things in that maximal amount of resolution or minimal amount of resolution without losing sight of everything else that's in the model. So that's why when we say it, it's like this is as much as you can think about, or you could hold in your mind or consider in a narrative or in your own psychology when regarding a single inequity, a single imbalance. Um, because anything more than that, and you'd have to lose sight of something else. This is just sort of a fixed size maximum amount, in which case you can see everything from everywhere. And the important thing to understand, though, it's pretty much a fake construct, because you've essentially said, I've got limits here. This is only so big. And that is essentially the same thing as saying, I'm going to create a context. So within this framework, I can see everything, which is why you can look at a story, and not only can you see everything in the story objectively, theoretically, but it also includes not only what's in there and how it flows and where it goes, but also what happens over time. So a narrative, it contains the beginning, it contains the conclusion, the end. It contains the pathways through which everything travels, and it also contains the sort of the values of how they change over time, where they are at the beginning versus where they are at the end, but only because it is a contained, artificially contained environment that provides a single context to understand everything within it. The minute you step outside of that, then you are unable to actually, then you lose context, and then meaning becomes arbitrary.
Cool. Nice explanation. Okay, why don't we just introduce them to the equation, the primary equation, and just so they know it's in there, and that again, these aren't just little boxes with words in them, which they can appear to be. All those words that took about over a year to find all those words and put them into that order, because they represent processes of the mind, and those processes of the mind are all um, defined by that size of mind constant. So when you think about a problem, these are all the different perspectives you can take and the different considerations. Like, should I look at it in terms of hope? Let me try that. Let me look at it in terms of fears. Okay, yeah, you can try that. And that process of looking at it in terms of those things, each one then creates a word like hope or fear in the model. But and so it represents all of those mental processes we have available to us. Right now, Chris is drawing out this initial equation. Um, it's the primary equation that we began with, that formed our KTAD method that we've talked quite a bit about so far. It's not really a math equation, it's more of a logic equation. So let me explain the operations in the logic equation before we get into it, so you don't mistake it for math. It's not like E equals MC squared, though if you iterate this, one of the equations, you'll end up with E equals MC squared, which is, it would be T over K equals AD if you did that version of the equation. So the first thing I'll say is there's several versions of this equation. Is knowledge and thought are played against each other, and the one we're looking at, K over T equals AD. In other words, you're parsing knowledge and thought. You're saying when knowledge is parsed by thought, in this case, that's what the dividing line means, is parsed by, or is measured against, or is measured by. When knowledge is measured by thought, then it needs to balance. That's what the equal. It needs to come into balance. The result of that knowledge, parsing thought, needs to balance with ability times desire, which is basically ability blended with desire to become desirability. Desirability is the combination of what you want and your capacity to get it, which is ability. So if you have a zero ability and great desire, well, that puts you in frustration right to begin with, but you absolutely have a zero value if you desirability is zero because no matter how much you want it, you can't have it. Okay. So that's different than desire. Desire is, I want it 100%. Ability is you got 0% capacity to get it. You put the two together and you end up with a desirability of zero. Similarly, if your ability to do something is 100%, but you have absolutely no desire to do it. I mean, the most unpleasant thing you can ever think of doing. So you have a desire of zero and an ability of 100%. Well, then you end up with a desirability of zero again. So if either one of those is zero, so the degree of desirability, the degree of motivation, therefore, to go out and try to achieve something or to do something or participate in something or even to continue thinking about a thought, or I'm done with that, I want to think about something else. The desirability of continuing, which is what motivation is, desirability, it drives it all. That depends on the degree of ability and the degree of desire blended together in that way, kind of like a multiplication, but not really. It's not math. It's just the impact of one on the other. So when those two are put together as being their combined influence, then the separate relationship of knowledge to thought, that now needs to come into balance with the equal sign with the desirability. So in other words, people look at knowledge and thought and say, well, knowledge and thought, that's where my logic is. That's where my reason is. I look at knowledgeability, so or knowledge and thought. So when I'm doing with that, I can just look at that and say I'm logical all the time. I'm thinking logically, and they believe they are until you realize, why are you thinking about this instead of putting your logic and applying it to something else? Well, the reason you've chosen that thing is because of the desirability. There are some things that you are eager to try to logic, and other things you don't want to give it the time of day to bother logicking it. So you're always driven by emotion, by desirability, in a sense, by passion on one side, and by reason on the other side. You always got those two things going, and one of them guides the other. So while you can be totally logical about what you're looking at, the decision about what you decide to spend your time on is really a passionate decision coming from desirability. And that's why they try to find balance, and they do. So that if your desirability reaches a level where you're no longer that interested in pursuing it, you'll stop trying to logic it. You'll stop trying to reason it out because I got far enough. I kind of understand this. I'm moving on to something else. Or if the desirability is great, you'll just keep hitting with that logic and hitting with that logic, because it doesn't matter if you've gone around 14 times, which is why we end up going into these mental circles where we just get stuck going around the same thing over and over again, hoping something will change. Definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again in the hopes the result will be different. Well, sometimes it is, because times change and the situation changes, and maybe this next time you go through, it'll actually come out differently. Surprise, surprise, because something fundamental has changed in the time it took you to go around one more circuit of thought. And so if your desirability is high, you'll just keep whipping around that track, over and over again, racking up the mileage. The problem is, the longer you do that, of course, then other things you're not looking at, not paying attention to, because all your attention is there. And that leads to situations where it's detrimental to your safety or your mental health, not a good survival technique, not efficient. And therefore we begin to lose desirability the longer we do it, unless we have all kinds of reasons that we are still 100% desirable. Eventually that will tip, and then we'll stop logicking and find another target for our reason. Okay, so that's the primary equation. Now I don't need to put the
Let me just add a couple things.
Yeah.
So some practical things that you might have experienced or have heard or often show up in narratives. When looking at the balance between ability and desire, if you have the whole idea of, why did you climb that mountain? Because it's there. It's just like, okay, I don't necessarily, maybe I have a certain ability, so sometimes they're not, they're balanced, and so you get a relatively large amount of desire because it's almost the same as the amount of ability. So that you have people who are trying to do things because they feel like they're very able to. Other times you might, this happens with men a lot. They something that is very desirable because they can't get it. But once they get it, the attraction for having it is completely reduced. You see this with men going after a particular girl or after something, and then once they've achieved that goal, or they've reached that ability has been satisfied, the desire completely just evaporates. So it does also, you can see that relationship pop up a lot in human behavior. Um, that balance between ability and desire. It's also, you get people who are disabled, suddenly become undesirable. There's sort of, there can be a negative version of the same thing too, where people feel like they're not attractive, and therefore people don't like them, or they build build up their physique to be more desirable. So there is an interesting byplay between ability and desire that goes very strongly to motivation, particularly for men. And we'll explain why later, but it has to do with the nature of this built into this particular uh, arrangement of these elements in this equation. It's very much more descriptive the way men think than women, um, generally speaking. Okay.
This one equation here, there are many equations, and they would not mathematically seem that they could be possible from this. But when we're talking about mixing up that Rubik's Cube and twisting and turning, moving processes from one place to another, it creates different versions. This one here, with knowledge being parsed by thought, that's deductive reasoning, where thought goes in and says, let's take knowledge apart, put it back together, let's get rid of it, let's say this isn't pertinent, this is, and get it down. But the next equation in the line would be inductive reasoning, which is T over K equals dA, and while we're doing
Oh, okay, let me do that.
yeah,
Okay, hold on. I'll do that.
yeah. So that's one version is T over K, which would be inductive reasoning, because now at that point, you're basically using your knowledge to parse your thought and saying, well, what are these possibilities? And we're going to take that and say, here's where it leads based on knowledge, until you have thoughts that tell you more, as a possibility than what you knew to begin with. And so that second one, T over K equals AD. Now, the T over K equals AD, the thing about that is it can convert to show how it works. This is a good example of it, is if you replace T over K equals AD with E over M equals ST.
Oh, which one? This one? Oh,
That
you
one,
said
yeah,
E.
yeah, the T over
Okay,
K.
well, let me just do the mass, energy, space, time.
Mass and energy and space and time. Okay. And then as an example, this next one, which is T over K equal AD, if we do the same thing with it and use mass and energy and space and time, but put them in their appropriate positions here, which would be energy over mass equals space times time, or space time. Now, if you take that one, that's the E over M, and you just do a simple algebraic thing where you multiply um, the both sides by M, then you end up with E equals MST.
Okay, hold on.
Right. And that probably looks familiar to you because it's the same relationship for that equation as E equals MC squared. Now, we won't go into great detail on that, but E equals MC squared is energy, mass, and here we have thought and knowledge. And c squared, why do we have S and T, space and time? Why is it c squared? Well, it's kind of the speed of light multiplied by the wavelength of light, which is space times time. And that's why you get c squared, and that's why it appears to be a constant. We'll talk about that later. But the main point is here that if you look at the two equations, E equals mc squared and T over K equals AD in this form, where it's, you know, ends up with that, then you can see that just like a lot of mass, or a little bit of mass, can generate a lot of energy in Einstein's relativity equation. Similarly, it takes an awful lot of energy to make a piece of mass. And the same thing in the mind, that a little bit of knowledge can generate an awful lot of thought, but at the same time, it takes a tremendous amount of thought to create a single bit of knowledge. So that relationship, that inverse relationship there, that exists in E equals mc squared also exists in T over K equals AD. And each equation can talk about these relationships in a different way and say, well, how much of this does it take to do that? And what has to be in balance with what? These are the four primary equations on the left-hand side there. And those primary equations.
Well, they're one half of them, because this is only representing one side.
Right. And so it does represent one side, because later you can actually have A over D equals KT. But the order in which these things occur is important, because time is an element in here, but it's also sequence. And so again, looking at whether you put in the spaghetti first or you boil the water first, which one's important. So if you change it to a DA, that's different than an AD. And so it creates a number of combinations, so that you'll actually have K over T equals dA, K over T equals AD, and T over K equals AD, and T over K equals dA. Then you have to say, what happens if we put A and D on the left-hand side? Because we want to parse desire with ability instead of parsing knowledge with thought. And you end up with the equivalent form of the equation, only now you're trying to measure desire against ability and ability against desire. And then, depending on what order you apply knowledge or thought on the right-hand side, that changes the impact, just like getting mush or getting spaghetti.
This is actually, but it's not, is it DA or is it DT?
No, it'll be DA there. Those are the first four, and the other ones are the ones that make up the set of 16.
Hey, guys.
So we have this set of four at the top, then we have another set of four at the bottom that take that form with the D and the A on the left, and then change the order in which K and T are applied sequentially. And then we end up having to do the ones that relate between like the D and the T and the A and the K, and create those equations. It turns out that these equations actually define the nature of the archetypal characters in a story before you break them into smaller elements, the major family characters, that where each character is based out of a particular family. These are the logic equations that define and demand those characters exist. And those characters represent facets of our minds, large facets, high level facets in that size of mind constant, big conceptual areas where one of them is the voice of reason, one is the voice of one is the skeptic, for example. And these are major archetypes, and they represent major qualities of ourselves, the large families, so that when they come into conflict, we're parsing a problem by saying, is this something we should primarily be skeptical about, or primarily we should look at it with logic or with emotion or with total confidence, which would be the sidekick. These are all different archetypal characters based on these logic equations, not so much based on them as that we feel these characters in real life. Oh, that person he's the reason character. That's the voice of reason. This guy's the resident skeptic. We see them in real life because within our own heads, we have all of those. But when we're working in a large group, we tend to adopt one of those, and the group will self-organize to represent a large mind that has the same facets as our own individual minds, but each person will become a specialist in that area he's most comfortable with or most able to accommodate because of his skills. So you can see how we start with just a little tiny quad over on the left there, and then we start having these equations, and then we have the tower, and we whip things up and move them around to represent the kinds of considerations to try to muster the motivation to keep going against the way things are in the universe that won't change, but we're going to hold out, or we'll eventually kind of figure out a way to make ourselves alter the way we're approaching it and become a different person. But then from that, it comes down to these equations. The equations represent characters in fiction, and you find those people in real life as well, being the voice of reason or the resonant skeptic. So it's really all tied in together, and it's an explanation. All of it, in the end, it's nothing more than narrative genetics, and you're looking at narrative genomes, which is each one of those particular narratives. You're on, Chris. He's not. Okay. He's gone away for a moment.
No. Sorry, I was the dogs were barking, so I muted it.
Okay.
I have no comment on that. I mean, I don't really have a follow-up for that.
Do you want more?
Thanks.
It's thundering.
Okay.
So,
I think we gave him a pretty good view. If we went beyond this, we'd start going into the details, unless you got something else you want to add to their introductory overview of.
yeah,
what-
just one thing, and that is part of the getting back to the idea of the bias that's built into it.
Sure.
One of the things that we did is not only by laying out the items in this quadrant and in the positions we have them, which would sort of mirror this top equation. The way to read a quad is to look at we chose arbitrarily, we chose to position things so that the items that are in a diagonal are considered to be sort of binary opposites, but that's not accurate. That they are opposites, but they're not the same thing. They're not two ends of the same thing. They're two different kinds of things, but along a similar frame of reference. So thought is not anti-knowledge. Now, so it's not the binary opposite, but it is the counterpoint to knowledge. So you've got, and if you're looking at it again from a K-base, that's why when we look at this one, we can see it separately from this. So we can easily see the knowledge being on its own and thought on its own. So we're seeing them as particles. We're seeing them as individual components and measuring them against one another. But when you're looking at a quad like this, that makes the codynamic, we call that a dynamic pair. And that means the codynamic pair is not going to be viewed in the same way. It's not going to be seen as that binary relationship. It's going to be seen more or less as a spectrum. So it'll be the equivalence of an analog, as much as can be seen analog from a K-based system. So the A times B, you don't know where A ends and D begins. So it's this blending, or you could, again, a spectrum between the two, and it can be more A or more D. And but that's the way why we constructed this quadrant in the way that we did. We had tried all sorts of different forms, and the quadrant seemed to be the best way to visually represent the types of relationships that we had discovered in this equation, because the equations came before the quads. We didn't really think of things in quads until later when we were trying to graphically represent them. So whenever you're looking at one pair as a binary, the other one will generally be seen as a spectrum, as a so one, the equivalent of particles and wave is not quite the right term, but close, some continuum. just as a way that you can evaluate the items in one or the other in one pair by looking at the continuum. So the measuring stick by which you can evaluate K or T is in terms of A and D. So that the way in which we put together this quad has a lot of logistical meaning that is really intended to encompass what's going on in these equations.
We hope you enjoyed this exploration into Dramatica theory presented by the Dramatica Company, world leader in narrative intelligence.
Oh boy. Throw a commercial in there at the end. Yes.
What the hell?